Good evening. I can't see the audience, so it's always weird to me, but thank you for everybody for being here. Welcome to our 14th annual DePaul College of Education Educational Forum. Thank you all so much for sharing your precious time with us this evening. I am Dr. Jennifer Miller, and I'm very honored and humbled to serve as the Dean of the DePaul College of Education. And I have been in this role for a little bit more than a year, and it's been fantastic. So this is my third forum, I think, so it's great. I will be very brief. We have a jam-packed, incredible forum. I'm very excited for you to hear from everybody. I want to say a big thank you to Diane Horowitz, who has spearheaded the planning and delivery of these important education forums for the last 14 years. And it's just, Diane, an incredible legacy and testament to your work and to us at the college, our commitment to community engagement, systems change, and improvement of our educational ecosystem toward equity. We see ourselves in the COE, College of Ed, as staunch supporters of lifelong learning and constant professional development, which is why we continue to do these forums. We have a deep responsibility to lean into our what must be done mantra and to see our work as closely tied to creating a better world for youth, families, teachers, counselors, schools, and communities. With that said, I will very briefly, although I'm going to let Dr. Conklin introduce herself mostly, but Dr. Hillary Conklin will be assisting and facilitating this evening. Dr. Conklin is an incredible scholar and an incredible teacher and one of our faculty in our teacher preparation. She does social studies, secondary education. She's also a department chair in the college and quite an amazing leader. And other than that, I will let her introduce herself. So thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you very much, Dean Miller, and good evening, everyone, and welcome. We are very excited to be holding this event tonight with some incredible educators who are going to help us think about how we educate for democracy. They're going to talk with us about the very real challenges of doing this work in our current moment, but also the really rich opportunities that we have in schools as the 2024 election approaches. I want to extend a warm welcome to the diverse audience that's joining us tonight. We have DePaul students who are preparing to be teachers and leaders at many different grade levels across the PK-12 spectrum. We have faculty, staff, and alumni, along with practicing teachers, people at nonprofits, and community members from across the region and the country. So welcome to everybody. As Dean Miller said, we in the college are very grateful to Diane Horowitz for her devoted work organizing this forum, and to Maya Mushitz, who has been instrumental in all the behind-the-scenes work to make this happen. As I think you all know, we're living in deeply polarized, socially unequal, and disconnected times. And the contentiousness of our larger society can make it feel quite daunting to engage with political issues in the classroom as we approach the upcoming election. We're all bringing emotions, lived experiences, and perspectives into the classroom. And this, of course, means both our students as well as us as educators. And so when we engage with issues related to the election, we have to take these emotions, experiences, and perspectives into account. As educators, we may be experiencing worry, anxiety, or hope. And it's important for us to be aware of and reflect on these feelings, as well as those that our students are bringing into the classroom. So tonight, we want to keep this context in mind as we focus on a few central questions. What is it that students want to know about the election, and what information do they need to understand the issues? How can educators address worries and uncertainties about engaging controversial issues and create classroom space for reflective discussion? How can educators help students process the results of the election once we get to November 5th and the days after? We're hoping that you leave tonight with the feeling that while we need to be mindful of the challenges of bringing election-related issues into the classroom, when we do this work with intention and care, schools can be a place of incredible opportunity to shape how young people learn to engage with and navigate civic issues. So to help us think about these opportunities, we have an amazing group of educators with us tonight from a variety of contexts who bring all kinds of experience to this conversation. So I'd like to introduce the 4 speakers that we have with us tonight. First, I want to introduce Dr. Leah Bueso. Leah is an assistant professor of urban education at the University of Illinois Springfield and a researcher with the Civic Engagement Research Group. Leah received her PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles, and her JD from the University of Michigan Law School. Her research examines issues of racial and socioeconomic inequality in K-12 schools with a specific focus on school law, social studies, civic education, and special education. Leah is also a credentialed special education teacher and a reading specialist for children diagnosed with a language-based learning disability. Next, we have Pakaj Sharma. Pakaj is a U.S. government and U.S. history teacher at Niles North High School in Skokie, where he's taught for over 20 years. Pakaj also is active in his union and is the president of the North Suburban Teachers Union, as well as vice president of the Illinois Federation of Teachers. He was a member of the Illinois Committee to rewrite the social science standards, and he was a Golden Apple winner for his exemplary teaching in 2016. Pakaj is the parent of 2 public school students in Evanston. Next, we have Hector Sanchez. Hector is a bilingual Spanish social studies teacher at Greater Lawndale High School for Social Justice, and he has been a teacher for 13 years. He's a native of South Chicago and the son of Mexican immigrants. He's a proud product of Chicago Public Schools, attending Adams Elementary School on the Southeast Side. In his experience at Chicago Public Schools, he's served as a bilingual teacher as well as an English language program teacher. He knew teaching was for him because of his experience as a Little League manager at the East Side Little League. After teaching, he will become a farmer and cattle herder in Michoacan, Mexico. And finally, we have Shonda Ronen. Shonda is currently a principal and curriculum director at Bunker Hill School District. Prior to her current role, she spent 14 years as a kindergarten and first grade teacher. Shonda worked with Teach Plus as a teaching policy fellow and was the elementary team leader on the task force that rewrote the social science standards in 2017. She has presented across the state on the importance of inquiry, questioning, and implementing the Illinois social science standards in an impactful way. Shonda was recently recognized by Those Who Excel in 2024 and awarded the IPA Kaskaskia Region Principal of the Year Award in 2022. She is a parent of 2 public school students. So you can see that we have an incredible wealth of expertise and vantage points among our panelists tonight. In just a moment, Dr. Bueso is going to spend about 10 minutes setting the stage for us to give us a little bit of context for the work of Educating for Democracy. She's then going to facilitate a conversation with our frontline K-12 educators so that we can learn about their different school communities and contexts, what they're hearing from students about the election, and then what specifically teachers are doing in their classrooms in relation to the election. In our remaining time, we will turn to audience questions. So I want to let all of you in the audience know that if you do have questions, please put them in the chat as they come up. We're going to gather these and then address as many as we can in the later part of our session. And I also want to draw your attention to some resources that are featured in the chat. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Bueso to get us started.
Muted.
Oop.
Sorry about that. You'd think I'd have that down by now, but of course not. Thank you, Dr. Conklin. As Dr. Conklin said, my name is Leah Bueso. I am an assistant professor of urban education at the University of Illinois Springfield, so not too far down the road from you all. As well as a researcher at the Civic Engagement Research Group, which is based out of the University of California, Riverside. So I'm very excited to be here with you all tonight. And despite the fact that I'm now at the university level, you cannot take the K through 12 teacher out of me. So I want to start off tonight with a little self-reflective exercise. Now, I recognize this is a webinar and I can't actually get to talk to you all. I'm just going to be talking at you. But what I'd love for you to do is just step back and think for a second about your time in school, in grade school. So this might be a bit further back for some of us and actually pretty recently for a few others of us. But thinking back to that time when you were in kindergarten to your senior year of high school, did you actually learn about voting and elections? And if you did or you didn't, and you're in college now or you went to college, did you learn about it then? Now, I can't obviously hear your responses, but if you were lucky enough to get these opportunities and you're lucky enough to remember them, for those of us that are a little older in the room, I want you to think back to what those experiences were actually like. Did they include diverse perspectives? Did they feel safe and supportive? Were you talking about voting and elections in a way that let you research issues, let you ask questions, let you explore areas that you wanted to explore? And were those learning opportunities connected to any kind of real life experience? Maybe some of your teachers recommended you become poll workers or you served on a campaign. Now, I don't know what the answers are for you all. I can tell you what my experience was, though. Unfortunately, when I was in high school, I didn't get to talk about elections or voting. I do remember being handed a voter registration form by someone during my senior year. It was a very unceremonious handing of this voter registration form, and there was no discussion. There were no instructions or sit down of like, hey, how do you do this? Or why do you even want to do this? There was no follow-up. There was no connection to my life. And who knows if this is connected, but I basically didn't vote that year. And I also didn't register. I didn't end up voting until the end of college. And pretty much only because I was really excited about the candidate. So who knows if it would have taken me a bit longer to start voting if I hadn't been excited by the candidate. Now, today I can proudly say I am a consistent and diligent voter, but at the time I didn't feel the need to be that way when I was young until I actually started researching and discussing societal issues and how they impacted me and other people. So that's just my food for thought to start off this discussion. I don't know, unfortunately, what your experience was. I wish I was able to talk to you about it. We could talk about it with the panel, but hopefully some of you had better experiences, but I know too often actually that a lot of you probably had experiences that were similar to mine. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Okay. Many of you in this room or your colleagues might be thinking, I'm not going to touch this election with a 10-foot pole. You couldn't pay me to talk about this election in my classroom. And I completely understand that feeling. It's totally natural, right? We have, as educators in this polarized environment, a fear of being perceived by either our students, families, or even our colleagues as being partisan, as being political, or maybe you just don't even want to deal with the potential pushback that's going to come with it. I get that, totally. But whether you're ready to admit it or not, this election is going to affect your classroom in some way. This election, similar to our election in 2020, is unlike many others. And all of our students, including just like us, are being inundated constantly with messages about the election. And they're going to need to process these messages. And what better place than the classroom where you can create, or educators can create, a safe and supportive environment to make sense of what's happening around them. Now, you may not teach about voting. You may not even be a social studies educator, but that doesn't mean that this isn't going to touch your classroom. So these emotions, as Dr. Conklin sort of referred to at the beginning, are going to be quite high, right? At this moment, all of the emotions in our country are running pretty high, and we need a place to express and process those emotions. And so regardless of what sort of classroom you actually find yourself in these days, you're going to be dealing with students who are maybe worried, hopeful, excited, uncertain, or terrified. And you might be too, right? These are issues that are affecting all of us as well. And then that's just before the results come in, right? Wait until the actual results come in. Then students are really going to want and need to talk about the implications for everything that's happening. If I think back to the election in 2020, we didn't have results right away. And so there was this whole period in between November and January where students were like, what's happening? What's happening? You know, how do we know who's going to win? So there was a lot of interest from students in trying to figure out, what is the next step? What is this going to mean for my community, for me? And a lot of them just started to kind of honestly nerd out about election protocol, which was pretty cool. So why not channel all of this energy, all of this emotion into productive learning about voting in elections? Let's go to the next slide. So some of you might feel like you can't do this, but for those of you that may not know, public schools, when they were originally founded, they were founded with a democratic purpose. Back in the early 1900s, schools were actually charged with preparing young people for participation in our democracy. That was our original purpose. Now, we've kind of lost our purpose a little bit, and the focus of school has really deprioritized democratic education and instead prioritized the economic purposes of education. So thinking about preparing for jobs in college rather than preparing for being a citizen who participates in our democracy. And some people might argue that that deprioritization of democratic education has kind of led us to where we are today, right? We're coming off at least a decade of highly intense political polarization that has resulted in incivility, impeachments, insurrections, and challenges to certified results. So that's just in the last 10 years or so. And now we're about to embark on an election that is increasingly polarized. And there's renewed efforts to interfere with the election through disinformation and misinformation, intimidation, voter suppression, legal challenges. So much is happening, and all of this is trickling down to local elections and community events, something schools are really feeling, right? Even at the local level, at school board elections. And then it all comes down and winds up at the foot of the doors of schools. And now we have teachers who are censoring themselves from talking about systematic inequality and controversial issues. We have states that are trying to erase the existence of racism, sexism, ableism, and many of the other isms that are prevalent in our society, while also promoting the surveillance of teachers in the name of parental rights. And students are in the middle of all of this, and they're desperately trying to make sense of the world around them. And the adults are not necessarily doing what we need to do. So I sort of challenge all of us, especially those of us that are in the room, to step up so we can help these young people make sense of what's happening. All right, next slide. Okay, so let's assume for a moment, if I'm just going to play devil's advocate, that schools shouldn't talk about voting in elections. I think you can realize by now I don't believe that, but let's just play devil's advocate. Who's going to fill the void if we don't talk about it? So this graph, which I hope you can see a little bit better than me, but is from a study done by the Circle, which is out of Tufts University. And they asked young people where they were getting their information about elections. And most of them, the overwhelming majority of them, are getting it from social media. The other large influence is their family, which is great. It's really great if young people are going home and talking about elections with their families. But what we don't know about that family is what is the quality of that discussion and learning that's happening at the home. For some folks, it might be really high, and that's awesome. And for other folks, it might not be. We don't know. But we do know that the family is a big influence on young people and where they get their information about elections. And then the other big influence is the internet, which we know is a super duper reliable place to get information. So it's interesting because young people actually only said that only about 40% of them said that they were getting information from their teachers or from their schools, which is pretty low. That means 60% of people or of young people are not talking about voting or elections in school. And that aligns with some other research I'm going to talk about next. But it's interesting because this sort of debate of whether or not schools should be talking about voting elections, it's not unlike debates that we've had in the past about whether or not schools should teach sex education, right? To a small minority, it might feel inappropriate or something that only families should pass along. But most of us actually recognize that we can't really just put young people in bubbles and keep them, secured from all the ideas out there in the world, especially now that they all run around with these magic devices in their pockets and access to all kinds of information. So I guess the question that we're left with is it better to shrug responsibility, close our eyes, and hope for the best? Or should we re-embrace this democratic purpose of our schools to educate young people in a way that ensures that they can think independently, that they know how to use information and knowledge and technology to draw their own conclusions? So this is where schools really come into play. They are very uniquely positioned to play a critical role in preparing young people for democratic life. Every school is going to have a different context, but we can guarantee when folks go to school is that their teachers are specially trained to facilitate discussions, simulations, and other learning opportunities in ways that families and the internet may not be. School also provides a really unique space where young people can hear diverse perspectives. So that might not be occurring at the home or in their communities, especially if they live in racially or socioeconomically segregated communities. So in fact, for some students, it might be the only place where they get exposure to other diverse perspectives. And in some instances, if the school isn't naturally diverse, then this might have to be simulated, but at least a simulated diverse perspective is better than no diverse perspectives, right? And having all of us live in these echo chambers virtually and physically. And then perhaps most importantly about schools is that whatever learning experiences we decide to provide about voting and elections, they can be provided to all students. So it helps eliminate some of the gaps that we're going to get where some lucky few kiddos got to are living with a family who are very politically or civically engaged and very educated about these issues, or maybe exposed to advanced classes or extra tutoring or something like that. So we can reach all young people this way. So schools are a very important place. All right, let's go to the next slide. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a ton of research about young people in K through 12 and what they're learning with regards to voting in elections. Most of the time, research on voting in elections, when they're talking about youth voters, they're actually talking about 18 to 29-year-olds, or in some cases, they cut it off at 18 to 34-year-olds. So there's not too much out there. What we do know mirrors what we saw in the previous slide, which is that some students are talking about voting in elections, but not everybody, right? So this chart comes from the same study from Circle at Tufts University, and it's showing that about 50% of students were actually taught about registering to vote in high school. So I guess I was in that other 50%. But that still means that 50% are not being taught about registering. And then we see some gaps here based on race and ethnicity in access to these opportunities. When we're talking about whether or not youth were encouraged to vote by a teacher, the rates go a little bit higher, which is great, but being encouraged and being taught are, two different things. And unfortunately, the gaps by race and ethnicity actually increase when we're talking about encouragement. But this is really all we kind of know about what's happening with voting instruction in schools. So let's assume that at least 50% of kiddos out there are not getting any education about voting in elections. That's not good. And even if we assume the other 50% are, all we really know is that they've learned something about registering. We don't know anything about the extent to which they're talking about important societal issues, talking about the history of suffrage, talking about inequalities in our voting system, or anything like that. So, besides needing more research, if we want to provide high-quality learning opportunities in a way that John Dewey, the educational philosopher, imagines it, we need to be facilitating learning experiences that expand beyond just talking about registering to vote or encouraging students to get out the vote campaigns, right? We need learning experiences where students are learning to think critically about their own political beliefs and the beliefs of others, to learn about and consider diverse perspectives on different societal issues, opportunities to engage in respectful deliberation with people who think differently or look differently from themselves, to participate in authentic and meaningful experiences that are relevant to their actual lives, and to basically engage with pressing societal issues that impact their communities. John Dewey pointed out that the most important learning takes place not through experience itself, but reflecting on those experiences. And so having these opportunities to actually discuss and reflect on societal issues, particularly those that are important to a given election year, is crucial. Now, I know that the political polarization and the rampant disinformation makes these goals much harder to accomplish, but they really only further prove why these are critical skills that young people need to develop, right? And unfortunately, this job often falls at the feet of social studies educators, and it really shouldn't be falling at the feet of just social studies educators, because while every teacher doesn't necessarily need to teach about the structure of government, every teacher can reinforce bigger ideas about civics. We're all civic educators. We are communicating every single day ideas about what it means to engage in our society. Indeed, schools are basically micro societies themselves, and they're communicating civic lessons that may not even be explicitly taught, but might be implicitly taught. Ideas like who belongs in our community, who matters, who gets to make decisions, who gets to have their voices heard, how are those decisions made, what issues are important that we should spend talking about. And so in that regard, all teachers, whether you're a social studies educator or not, are role models for our civic goals and dispositions, and role models can spend their time in the school building modeling productive discourse, civic engagement, how to reflect, how to be informed, how to show critical thinking, and do all of this in ways that are teaching students way beyond just what are our three branches of government. All right, next slide. Now, because schools are these critical entry points for democratic education, this brings up really important questions about the role of educators ahead of the election. So, in particular, do educators actually see themselves as defenders of democracy, as critical pillars of democratic education? Do they understand that they actually have the power to strengthen democracy by preparing young people in this way? And is this something worth fighting for? We know that democracy is really only as good as the education that surrounds it. And because our government rests upon popular suffrage, we can't hold our elected officials accountable without preparing young people to know how to engage in important societal issues, how to understand, how to conduct their own research, how to analyze bias and misinformation. And to do otherwise, to neglect that responsibility, basically means we're sending young people out into the world without these skills. and often back into the communities that may not have gotten this education themselves, or maybe they did, or communities that might be demographically isolated or in some sort of political echo chamber. So then what's the responsibility for educators to engage with young people in discussions about the elections and voting? In my mind, it's pretty high, right? Without inclusive spaces and safe spaces for students to articulate what they think about societal issues and to make sense of those issues, it's a lost opportunity to treat our students with respect as full citizens. And I use citizens not in the legal terminology as undocumented or not, but citizens as people who participate in our society. And we may be facilitating spaces or doing a great job facilitating spaces where we're teaching kids to read and solve equations and do awesome science projects. And that's really, really important. But without discussion and deliberation about societal issues, we're really not developing full civic actors. So on that note, how can teachers and administrators actually do this, especially in the context of the upcoming election? So I'm going to let our teacher panel speak directly to this question, but I'll sort of leave off on saying one silver lining to the current political turmoil that's going on are that there are so many entry points to young people's lives and their lived experiences, and there's natural momentum to channel students' interests and emotions into engaging them in meaningful learning experiences about voting and elections. So in today's panel, we're going to hear from a group of educators who are attempting to do this work in their schools. And because civic discussions are important for all grades and all subjects, our panel are going to be providing us with perspectives that range from the elementary, middle, and high school level, as well as across demographic contexts and regional geography. And so as you all are listening, I know your specific school context or your community might align more specifically with one panel member or another. So it's important to consider your own context as you're planning for the coming months. All right. I think I'm turning it back to Hillary, right? Dr. Conklin, for you to introduce the speakers. Or should I go straight into the questions?
I think you can just go straight into the questions.
Okay, awesome. All right. So I'll just remind us all that we have 3 lovely panelists on this teacher panel. We have Shonda, we have Hector, and we have Pakaj. So I'm going to start off with getting to know a little bit more about you all and where your school is in the community you work in. So this question is open to all of you. Shonda, maybe we'll start with you, and then Hector and Pakaj, feel free to step in when you feel ready. But tell us a little bit about your school and your community.
So thank you again for having me. I am Shonda Ronen, and our school district is in Bunker Hill, Illinois. It is a very small rural school district, lacks a lot of diversity as far as racial diversity, but we have a lot of socioeconomic diversity, and we are very much a conservative area.
Awesome, thank you.
I'm Pakaj Sharma. I teach in Skokie. It's great to be here. Thanks, everybody. Skokie is a really diverse, immigrant-heavy community right outside Chicago. We have students who come from Skokie, Morton Grove, Lincolnwood, and Niles. So it's diverse racially, ethnically, religiously, and also socioeconomically.
Hello, I'm Hector Sanchez. So I teach at Greater Lawndale High School for Social Justice, which serves the Little Village community on North Lawndale. And we are on the west side of Chicago. Our school is about 87% Hispanic and 12% African American, and less than 1% white or other. So the Little Village neighborhood is predominantly Hispanic, and the Lawndale neighborhood is predominantly African American. This is a really interesting neighborhood school because if we look at Chicago demographically, it's a pretty segregated city. So to have a school that serves, 2 of our largest minority populations is unique. The area to me is rich in culture and rich in small business, but it is an immigrant and working class neighborhood. And our goal there is to teach elections beyond just voting, to encourage our students and young people to involve themselves in their civic arenas and other ways aside from voting, and to be active members in their democracy.
That's awesome. Thank you all. So my next question is open to all of you. Feel free, anyone can answer, and we don't have to go in a particular order. But we'd like to know, how are your students actually thinking and talking about the election right now? What's on their mind?
Can I go first?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we are actually going to start our unit of study in about a week and a half. So right now, I just hear students, talking about, asking each other, who you going to vote for, who you going to vote for, and then trying to elicit that information out of me as well. Like, who are you going to vote for, Mr. Sanchez? I do constantly have to refer them to the Chicago Board of Ed policy, which states that we cannot endorse one candidate or one party or another. So then they try to ask, who are you not going to vote for then? But, that's an endorsement as well. Some of the concerns I have seen from students is their navigating of what they see in the traditional media as opposed to what they see on social media. I would say the influence of divisive messaging to our two populations, because it is something that you see a different rhetoric being targeted to the different populations. We see a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric, which is something that is very prevalent in the community we work at, and it kind of just like confuses students because they have an experience of going to school with immigrant populations, and then to see something on the internet, just causes them to be confused and to ask questions. I would say another thing that's very influential to what they talk about and what they know is the use of memes, and how they target certain audiences with different memes.
Mm-hmm.
I teach a government and civics class for high school students. So in those classes, we're talking about the election every day. The students are, I think, very curious. They're energized around the election. For a lot of them, this is the first time they're really aware of what's going on. Many of them were in middle school or elementary school 4 years ago. I think a lot of them have real trouble developing political empathy for anyone who wouldn't feel the way that they or their immediate family does. So one of the things we talk a lot about is how our community is pretty diverse in lots of ways, as I said before, but not so diverse when it comes to politics. And how a lot of the students might have different beliefs than their family members who live in other parts of the country or grandparents or things like that. And so I think that's a real opportunity for them to develop an understanding of other people, and then to understand how this election can be so close, because in their minds, they just don't understand how this can be such a close election and how people can feel so strongly about the two candidates when for many of them, it's pretty clear. And I thought Hillary spoke well about it earlier. It's like when, as an educator, I'm excited a lot of future educators on this call. It helps me just to understand the state of our democracy in our country, because I get to examine it with my students and we talk about it out loud. And I think it's helpful for me to sort of process with them how we all live in bubbles in different ways. I think Hector said it really well, whether it's consuming social media, looking at memes, or just talking to like-minded people. And as adults, we face that. Our students definitely face that. And I think we're there to model for them this idea of trying to understand other perspectives in a respectful way, while they can certainly keep their own beliefs. They, when they're 15 or 16 or 17, most of them have very strongly held beliefs that have come after years of growing up with their families and friends and consuming media the way they do. So, it's not like as teachers, we're trying to get them to change what they think, but to understand why they feel the way they do, and why their cousin who lives in, downstate Illinois or Tennessee, or the grandpa who lives, in Texas would feel very differently than them.
Punkage, I have a feeling that your students and our high school students would have some really cool discourse around the election, because it sounds like they might be at different perspectives there for sure. Already my own son, who is in 6th grade right now here at my school where I'm the principal at, has came home and talked about the election. In their current events class, they watched the presidential debate, and their teacher was asking them just questions about who do you think answered that question better and why? And he was talking about how he often was the only one raising his hand during certain times of that. And I'll be honest, I thought that was really neat. I'm glad that he got to be a minority perspective in his classroom, because he's not going to be able to experience that very often. And so him being able to experience being that minority perspective where he was the only one raising his hand in certain instances and having that different perspective than the rest of his classmates, I thought was really cool whenever he would come home and talk to me about that. So they're definitely discussing it even at those junior high levels.
Yeah, and you all mentioned to a certain extent that young folks are struggling with developing political empathy, or that's the term, Punkage, that you used, but you all were sort of touching on that. And I'd love to ask, how do you try to help them develop that muscle, right? So we know young people, their brains are still developing, and so this is going to be a journey, so to speak, and you probably can't expect them to develop that muscle over the course of one semester or 1 year. But what do you specifically do to help encourage that that behavior? Do you use class contracts? Do you develop class norms? What are some of the things you do out there?
I think it starts just at the very beginning. So even with pre-K, kindergarten, and 1st grade, I was a 1st grade teacher and a kindergarten teacher. I think it's very important to start talking about differing perspectives. They're very egocentric at those younger ages, and it's important that they understand other points of view. So anytime that you can really pinpoint that and make it very clear in the classroom is very useful. So I would oftentimes do this in the classroom as far as even just voting on simple things in the class, like, well, why do you think that? Why does this person think that? In literature, when you do read alouds with your students, even at the younger levels, pinpointing out like different characters and why does this character feel this way? Why does that character feel that way? When they're having disagreements, even at those younger levels, pointing out feelings and empathy is something that we teach a lot in our schools. We have respect the red, and our E in red is empathy. And we're constantly talking about how that's feeling, how other people are feeling. And so that is very important to us. And I think it starts even at pre-K, K1.
Absolutely. Hector, Punkage, do you want to add?
I think Shonda made a good point about where students are at psychologically. And she mentioned good, good practices in an English and a literature class. I have the luxury of teaching civics, so since day one of our class, I treat the students as experts, and their voice and their opinions and their perspectives are the cornerstones of the class. So throughout the year, we're building that, and we're trying to like include empathy within our curriculum. But like I said, I think one thing that for sure helps our students is for them to be treated like experts, for them to be given the space to express their opinions, but also when they do struggle, to know that as adults, as professionals, we are there to support them, that they can be comfortable. Not that they're gonna make a mistake, but if they do make a mistake, that they're gonna be supported. And another thing is, I always encourage students to be critical of the information, to corroborate what they hear, to look at the reliability of the sources that they are using, and to be able to differentiate between something that is credible and non-credible. And also to understand that, especially during elections and in a general election like the presidential election, is you have two sides who want to win. And sometimes they'll exaggerate or use hyperbole to win. And obviously, like anything, is if you come across a meme, I tell them, fact check it. Like, a meme is there to present an idea. It doesn't mean that there's actual policy behind that meme. and also to try and understand any bias that they see from any news sites or any other sources from which they're getting information.
Yeah, I love what Hector said, about having them analyze the bias that they might see in a meme or social media post. When we treat them like political scientists, so sometimes we'll say, okay, put aside your own feelings. What is the goal of the person who created this meme? Or if we look at it, a campaign ad, like who is it targeting? It might not be targeting you, but who is it targeting? What's the message? And why would that message resonate with some voters? And so it's not like, do you like this or would you vote for this? But why do some people feel that way? I think that helps them think of political empathy. And when Shonda said about, I love that your kids, teachers watching the debate with their students and asking, okay, who would like this or do you like this? Because it's the same thing, both sides really want to win and they will say things to appeal to certain voters for a specific reason. And you might not be in that group of voters, but why would that appeal to somebody? I think also it's helpful to have them do like a little reflection, who's someone that you care about, who's smart and you respect, who feels very different than you politically. And why would they feel it? Let's unpack it. And often it's generational. And I teach teenagers, so a lot of them are butting heads with their parents or teachers or other adults. So like you can see why. And a lot of them say, my parents grew up in another country, or it's based on someone's their job. What do they do for a living? If someone is in the fossil fuel industry, if someone's a police officer, if someone has this job, or you can see why they might feel differently than someone who has a different job. Or so it helps to explore the different aspects that go into someone's political ideology. And we talk about like how people develop their political ideology. And most of our students just have a similar ideology to their parents. And I always joke that my poor kids are cursed being Bears fans, and it's random. That's because my dad taught me to be a Bears fan, and my kids are Bears fans, and objectively they should be Bears fans because it's just pure misery. But we often sort of adopt the political ideology of our closest family members, and there's no real rhyme or reason to it sometimes, and we can't begrudge people for doing that because we all do that in some way with our identity markers. So I think those are all things that we try to do. It's easier for some kids than others. And I also tell them, I think Hector said, we're all learning. So someone might say the wrong thing. I might say the wrong thing. Kids will pull me aside and say, oh, you shouldn't be nice to that kid. Do you know in 7th grade, he said this? Do you know in 8th grade, he posted this? And I said, well, when I was in 7th or 8th grade, I said things that I don't believe in now, and I wouldn't want to stand behind now. And I've evolved over time. And I think, these students are evolved. I said, your parents evolved and your grandparents, and we're still evolving. So let's all give each other that space to be like, we can change. And if we shut people down, then that opportunity for growth usually isn't there.
Yeah, I love how all of you have integrated social emotional learning principles, even though, that might not be the core content you're teaching, into all of this, because it's so important, particularly for the younger kiddos, but as they go up through K through 12, and the more we expose it to them early, the more they'll be less reactive, or hopefully have more empathy by the time they get to their high school class or their college class. So I love that so much. Okay, we'll move forward in a different question. I think most of the people in this room are probably going to be wondering what I'm wondering, which is, what are some of the specific things that either you, if you are a teacher, or Shonda, I know you're a principal, so what are your teachers specifically doing to prepare for this election? So Shonda, maybe let's start with you. I've heard that your teachers are using the inquiry method. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So I was on the task force to rewrite the standards in 2017, and that's when we developed the inquiry skills of those standards. And the inquiry skills are just such an important piece to the standards. I always say that those are the why, and the disciplinary concepts are your how. And that's what I tell my teachers a lot of times too. Another thing, if there's anybody on here that is nervous or scared about talking about the election, use an inquiry approach. When you have your students question first, where they're the ones developing the questions, they're the ones that are asking those questions, they're the ones that are doing the research. It's not you providing information. You are not the sole sole provider of information. And that can even start as early as those younger grades. So even when I taught kindergarten and first grade, we were doing inquiry-based units where we started out with questioning. Maybe you have a voting process where you don't allow everybody to vote. You only allow like 4 of your students to vote on something in the classroom. And then you have a discussion on why was that fair or not fair? Should we have allowed everybody to vote, or did only these 4 kiddos need to get to vote? Having those types of conversations and then allowing your students to ask questions to then find out the answers for themselves, I'm just very, very passionate about. So all of our social science curriculum here at our school is all based around inquiry-based units at each grade level. And when you look at the K-12 science standards, most of those standards, like within the civics, when you're talking about the roles and responsibilities of individuals and leaders, and those responsibilities and how they have a responsibility then to the people and to differing communities, that's a kindergarten standard, you guys. So that's the type of stuff that we need to be teaching. And all too often at the elementary level, I feel like we are teaching holidays. We are holiday social science teachers, and that needs to go away. So when you're talking about the election, especially at the youngest levels, it's very important to get them to question, to get them to do some research on their own, to provide them with lots of different things. So when you're not the sole provider of that information, then you don't have to worry about, oh, I gave away my point of view only, or I was, being partisan or anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier that you're in a fairly conservative area. So how do you either encourage your teachers or how do your teachers encourage their students to sort of think about not just the experiences of students that are in the class, but maybe the experiences of folks outside of the class as well? I don't know if you have, if that's something that they're working on.
Well, already I'm going to get with Punkage and be like, hey, like we need to do a debate, together. But I do know the same social science class in 6th grade, here at our school that was watching the presidential debate. They then also had their own debate where they had to take on the viewpoint that was not necessarily their own. And I think anytime that you can ask students to do that, and I think Pakaj was also talking a lot about that, is when you can ask students to look on the other side and to, represent that other side even, and to think about that, then you're showing that you see those multiple perspectives. And at those elementary levels, I also just kind of want to throw this out there too. I don't think, and this is just my own opinion, but going and having first kindergarten, 2nd grade, 3rd grade students vote for, the presidential election and a mock voting for the presidential election, I've never done that. And I've always told our students that it's because we want educated voters. If you are educated on these 2 candidates, then yeah, go ahead and vote for them. But that's one of the reasons that why we don't vote until a certain age, because we want you to be educated. So instead, we're going to vote on something else, because it's very important to allow them multiple opportunities to vote, to give the differing perspectives of like why it's important that we vote and how everybody's voice is important and should be heard. But it's also very important that they understand they need to be educated on that. So if you're just going to pick somebody and you have no clue who that person is, then that doesn't matter. And I always did this little thing where my class voted on their favorite snack. Well, I just gave them the name of 2 snacks, and they've never tried them. They've never tried either one of these snacks. And the kids would vote on them and they'd be like, oh yeah, I want the purple Rockstar Sucker. No, I want the gooey green popsicle. Okay, well, you've never tried these. And then I go back and say, okay, well, now I'm going to explain to you what these snacks are all about. Well, this gooey green popsicle is actually broccoli flavored. And then they're like, what? Well, you weren't an educated voter. So that right there is just like a simple example of like how you can do something even at the elementary level where it makes sense to them and it's important to them and it's something they can actually be an educated voter on. Or you can make the tie that like you're not an educated voter, so you shouldn't be voting on that.
Yeah, and what I love, not only how you are adapting these voting related activities to the elementary age, but you're still engaging with them in that reflection and discussion And that's sort of the most important part of all of this, right? Is having them be able to voice their opinion and think about how they might have changed their vote or something like that. So that's awesome. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. Hector, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of your democracy and action work that you're doing with students, or if you have any other plans that you want to share with regards to discussing issues about the election.
So I will shed light on something that I've done in the past, and I'm most likely going to, continue with. But it's an inquiry-based project. So thank you all the inquiry-based project designers. Anytime there's an opportunity like that, I'm always like the first one to like try and either get professional development around or work closely. But the project I'm thinking of doing this year and I've done in the past, it's the Elections in Action project. And it does start with a question. The question that we always examine is how can young people or how can students increase voter turnout? And this is a project that involves 3 phases. So the first part is, understanding the question, why it's a question to begin with. So, looking at voter turnout in their neighborhoods, which in the west side of Chicago are, historically, some of the lower voting percentage in the districts in the country. So the students then, look at a little bit of the data. They create their own questions, which is, kind of like the launching pad to investigate the topic, to try and see, why it's so low. Are there, barriers to voting? Is it, apathy? So then the students will then, make a plan and take action on a solution. Speaking a little bit more in depthly on phase 1. So students will study, what elections are, why they are important, do research as to what has happened historically that got us to this point in their communities. Also, it's a community-based research, so they're interviewing people around them to see what the people in their communities know about the election, as well as how do my community members or the people around me, my family, how do they participate? Obviously at each, phase, students are creating more questions that, continue to guide further research and learning around the topic. Phase 2, they're continuing to build off of those questions, and this is a more in-depth community research as well as research that is supported by resources such as the Board of Elections website, articles and other primary and secondary sources that can help answer their questions. And they can also have an opportunity to create more questions, or they even, as a teacher, we always support them with some list of questions that can help narrow their research. By the end of the reflection at this point of phase 2, we kind of guide them towards creating a plan of action that is essentially going to help solve that question of how do young people, improve voter turnout. In phase 3 is where they're actually, refining that solution and executing that plan. And they also, this year I actually have the luxury of working with 2 community organizations that, also can serve to give them insight and inspiration as to what actions they have taken as community orgs, but also to help the students, so help them carry out those plans. And bring their visions to reality. So yeah, I'm really excited. Another option I have to teach, which I'm kind of hesitant, is to teach inquiry-based project based on the board of the Chicago Board of Ed election, which is new this year. But I've already lined up some community orgs for the presidential election, so I think that's where I'll go.
That's awesome. My data nerd heart is so happy that you start off all of your students with looking deep into the data and using that as a starting point to investigate their research on this question for them. And I just really appreciate that you're connecting the learning experience to actual action, right? If so often in our research, we find that if teachers are talking about voting in elections, it might just be like, hey, voter turnout's low. And that's the end. Not that simplified, but it is a lost opportunity to not only engage students more in the work, to make it more interesting for them, but to tie it back to their communities. And by partnering them with community organizations, you're actually helping them not only get to know folks that are in their own communities, but recognize what are some of the assets in their communities that they may not have even been aware of. So I love all of that. I highly encourage you to try the school board project. I worked with a teacher a couple years ago that did a project with the Chicago Public Schools school board, voting in elections, and they had the students looking into how they weren't they were requiring in-person voting during the pandemic. There weren't translated guides for folks, and the students ended up writing an op-ed about their experience. It was actually really, really, really cool. So I'm excited for that. I'll switch over and shift gears a little bit, and just Pankaj, how are you planning on talking about the election with your students? Do you have any specific issues or topics or maybe projects in mind?
Sure, yeah. I love the examples that Shonda and Hector gave. I think I especially like Shonda, the example of the uneducated voters, with that activity with elementary school kids. So I've heard of so many teachers who like to do a mock election. I think that's really powerful to get them to think about, whether they're educated or not about the candidates. And Hector, I love the idea of getting involved with something in the students' communities. One thing that I'm doing this year, I've done in the past, is I have students research some of the contested Senate seats and House seats that will decide the two chambers of Congress. And I think that's interesting for them because it helps them understand that it's not just about the presidential election. It's about these other chambers of Congress, and they get to see different candidates and their messaging to different electorates around the country. And then I think it's fun for them on election night. They're tracking not just the presidential election, but the results in some of the Senate or House seats, the races that will determine the composition of the two chambers. And then they also have to do a civic engagement project. It's part of the civics or government, state requirement. So that's pretty flexible, but I encourage them to think about if they feel strongly about this election, like most of them do, they can make phone calls from home. They can write postcards from home. They can knock on doors in Wisconsin if that's something they want to do. And one thing I've done in the past, we're going to do it again this year, is take a busload of kids to Wisconsin, to Kenosha. They have a choice about which campaign headquarters they want to get dropped off at to learn about how it works, get the Canvas app, and then go knock on some doors. And we talk about why that they don't do that in Illinois, because Electoral College, and the function of Electoral College means that you don't knock on doors for the presidential election in Illinois, but they might do that in a school board race, or they might do that in a local municipal election or something.
Yeah, I love your focus on down the ballot or local elections. That can also be a really good strategy if you're worried about political polarization in your community. You don't only have to talk about the presidential election, right? We're going to be electing a ton of folks in November, from senators to local school board members, judges. And sometimes young people can actually relate to that more because the president may not really affect your day-to-day life, but the school board member or a local judge might actually impact your life quite a bit, or the lives of people in your community. So that's awesome. I have a question sort of for all of you, but Hector in particular, I don't know if you want to tell us a bit about the work that you've been doing with voter suppressions and sort of current examples of that.
Sorry, I couldn't find my cursor on my screen. One thing I have done with the students is to analyze the history of voting, to see how voting has evolved from something that started off as just, landowning white males to where we're at today, where, 18-year-old citizens can vote. So I think it's important for students to recognize that this is a luxury that was fought for, that was struggled for. But I also am I am also very aware that the community in which I teach it's a heavy immigrant community. And not only within our immigrant students, but also a lot of our students from North Lawndale who have been disenfranchised through, several laws, felonies, records, things like that. And to kind of teach students that, civic participation goes beyond voting. I often try to tell students like, hey, would you rather be somebody who has one vote or somebody who can convince 10 people to vote, or even somebody who can convince, their local politician, whether it's their alderman, whether it's, their state rep, and I mean state rep as like their Illinois representative, not their congressman, their federal congressman. So I think it's also important to be aware of who our population is and what they can do in terms of participating, within their government.
Absolutely. Something I try to stress, particularly for teachers who are working in spaces where they might have a lot of either undocumented students in their classrooms or who have parents who might be undocumented, is to recognize that you can make a difference beyond just casting a vote yourself. That's a really important part of civic participation, but as you said, Hector, not the only way. And there's this wonderful website, it's called the Love Vote, that talks about, it shares the stories of lots of people who can't vote for a number of reasons, whether they're undocumented or they were formerly incarcerated or anything like that, sharing how the issues that are important to them and how they want people to think about them in the back of their minds when they go to cast their ballot. That's awesome. So I think I'll shift gears just a little bit, unless, sorry, Shonda or Pankaj, did you want to, I don't know if you all have teachers that are doing anything around voter suppression, either historical or current examples of that.
Not specifically, but in history class, I think some reference, we talk about the history of the suffrage or the fight for enfranchisement in American history, and I think that parallels now the importance of voting. Absolutely.
And there's so many examples out there of voter suppression happening today. So I know one way to keep it interesting for young people is, if they're kind of thinking about the history of voting rights and like, why does that even matter to me anymore? It's still happening today, and there's tons of examples. So lots of good ways to connect it with current events too. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to shift for us to start talking about challenges, which I think is probably on a lot of our minds right now, which is just sort of, what are some of the challenges that either you or your teachers, Shonda, in your situation, have faced while trying to teach about elections and voting, and how have you dealt with them?
I think as an administrator, it's very important that my teachers know that I want them to have those conversations, that if we're not going to be having civil discourse in our classrooms, then how do we expect them to have civil discourse outside of our school walls later on? They're not learning civil discourse around the dinner table necessarily. And so it's our job as teachers to do that. And so as an administrator, I try to make sure that our teachers know that I do support them. I try to ensure that because we are taking that inquiry approach, that it's student-led. And I think it's very important to have it be student-led, and that, again, that they're bringing up both perspectives, multiple viewpoints, and making sure that that minority perspective is always seen and heard too, and understanding why that's important, that their voice is important. And then like Pankaj was saying, like, who's somebody else that and respect that also might have a different perspective of you. I've been really trying to work with teachers on getting them resources. IllinoisCivics.org has a lot of resources out there for upper grades. As far as for younger grades, honestly, like, we've developed a lot of our own inquiry units around the election and just around voting and what that means. But I think them knowing that I do support them, and when I get those phone calls, which I do, I do get those phone calls, that then I can very explicitly say, well, the Illinois social science standards say this, and this is what we're doing right here, and this is why, and we're not saying one way or the other. I promise we're not doing any indoctrinating of any sort. And those are some of the conversations I actually do have to have. And so, but I am saying, but we are going to bring up both perspectives, and it's important that they understand both perspectives. And so your child has just as much of a voice in the classroom as somebody else. And even when, like, for example, my own son might have, the minority perspective in his own classroom, I think it's important that he then also feels just as confident to speak up when he might be the only one.
Yeah, and how would you, how could maybe for the administrators in the room or even the teachers in the room, how could you maybe proactively address some of this potential pushback? Do you have recommendations or for maybe systems that exist or things you've done that have worked before to prevent all of being inundated with phone calls, perhaps?
Well, I think Pakaj and Hector are obviously very educated, but I would say don't assume that every teacher in your district or in your school is educated on ways to give out multiple perspectives and ways to engage with questioning and things like that. So if you haven't done PD around questioning, and if you haven't done PD around those types of things where you are going to offer up multiple viewpoints and we are going to get the students to be the ones asking questions, then make sure you're doing that work too. I also do always ask for a heads up. I always tell my teachers to give me just a little heads up if you're going to be, going across the fence there, on a certain topic. And I want you to go there because I think it's important that we go there with our students. I think, Leah, you had brought that up earlier too, because if we're not having these difficult conversations in the classroom, they're not happening. And so it's very important that we have those within the classroom because we can model that. We are professionals. We are able to do that. So, but the heads ups are always great for administrators. So that way I know, and I can very much say to those parents like, oh, I know exactly what unit of study you're talking about. And yes, they started out with questioning and this is where it went to. And no, that perspective was also talked about because they brought in this resource or that resource or whatever they did. Being able to speak very, highly about the teacher and what they're doing because I already know about it is big.
Yeah. Well, on behalf of all the teachers who I know don't have administrators that have their back, I just want to say thank you because it makes such a big difference when your principal, your assistant principal is going to be there to support you. When you know that you're doing this well and allowed to do this and doing all the right things. But it helps to have someone in your corner. So thanks, Shonda. Hector and Pankaj, what sort of challenges are you all facing in your own context or your own school levels?
I think I think it was very important for me to start off the year and every year with my civics class, building community. And one of the, lessons I can think of is in which I as a teacher kind of, set the stage that us as a community, like we're made up of a bunch of individuals who have our very own set of values. And it's these values and these beliefs that are going to lead to like our political identity or the discourse that we continue to have in this class. So I think removing, the names of who said something and making it about the values of the people that are saying what they're saying. So as individuals, we can be as, nonpartisan as we can, but when like our rhetoric aligns more with somebody, instead of like making it about the rhetoric aligning with somebody who said something, making it more about aligning with the values that we have. And obviously like Chicago Public Schools does send out a big memo to us every year, letting us know how we can engage. So it's my job also as the teacher in the room to be that bridge and to explain to young people, hey, this policy is here to protect our voice. It's here to let us have discourse in a way that's going to be communal and it's going to represent the values that we have as human beings. and, not the silly memes we see online.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the challenge, every teacher is worried about hurting someone's feelings unintentionally, or getting that call from a parent or the administrator. And Shonda, thanks for supporting your teachers, saying, what happened here. And I think that can be scary, but it's also sometimes inevitable if we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, which is talking about difficult, complex issues in a thoughtful way. And there has to be a little bit of appropriate discomfort at times for kids to grow and learn and be challenged. And I think, like Hector said, it's about starting with building those relationships. So if you're scared, just if your kids know that they can trust you and you'll respect them, I think then they give you the benefit of the doubt most of the time, and that really can help. I think also running ideas by your colleagues. I think that's a really smart thing to do, is like, hey, I was going to share this primary source, I was going to show this ad, I was going to talk about this, and what do you think about that? And I still do that because that helps me think about, what are my blind spots here? What am I not seeing? And then I teach history classes too, and I try to bring current events and politics into that because that's what kids are interested in. So we were just talking about the anti-federalists and the federalists, and like, okay, how does that line up with some of the ideologies of Republicans and Democrats today? And they don't line up perfectly, and the kids want them to, or the Democratic Republicans and the federalists, and the two-party system. So we like, how would this line up with today? And students sometimes will want to be like, okay, well, what do Democrats think about this? Or that's what I'm going to go to. And we're like, no, let's talk about the ideas and how have these ideas shown up in history in the past. And people who we respect as great Americans, or people who have done good things for this country, or who've said they've done good things for this country, how have they differed on these very same issues that people disagree about today, like the size and role of the federal government, or whether or not we should aid other countries who are at war.
Yeah, I love that. And just maybe even reframing the way we think about challenges as potential opportunities to have these really important discussions with young folks, who often, when I interview them afterwards, say how grateful they are for these opportunities. I can say for myself, just in practicing this mindset, I come from a politically divided family, and instead of my initial thoughts of being like, oh man, why don't we all think alike? I now reframe that challenge as an opportunity to practice political empathy and learning to have productive discussions with people across the divide. So I think that can help us all in our journey there. We just have a couple minutes before we're going to jump into questions, but I have one kind of big meaty one for you all. And this isn't, you don't have to answer it. Maybe you haven't thought about it yet, but have you started to think about what you're going to do to help your students and your families and even staff reflect on what's going to happen after the election? And it's okay if you don't have an answer to this, but I think it's on all of our minds.
I think my initial thought is always, whether your candidate wins or loses, the job's not done. If your candidate won, you have to support them in pushing their agenda. If the candidate you wanted to win loses, it is your job to, make pushing their agenda more difficult. And like I said, this goes beyond voting. This is about participating in a democracy. You have a variety of people who represent you in our democracy, so you can leverage your skills, whether it's reading, writing, organizing, to make this democracy what you want to see it.
Yeah. Thanks, Hector. Shonda, Pakaj, if you want to try and tackle that one.
I think that it's what we had talked about earlier, where the president, I hate to say it, but they're not the be all end all of everything when it comes to the government and what's going to happen. There's a lot of people that we're voting for. There's a lot of people who represent us, and they are not the only ones. So making sure that they also know who are your representatives, who can you go to for support or assistance, how can you make your voice heard, despite who wins the election.
Same thing. I think sometimes it's so emotional for students and adults because the president is so symbolic of who we think we are as a country. And it's every 4 years, we're bound to be disappointed one time or the other. And so our country's always been bigger than who our president has been, just to reaffirm that before the election and after. And then the reality is the consequence of this election could have much more significant impact on some of our families and students and staff than others. And just being there for them, making sure they know their resources, their rights, their opportunity, and that they have allies there. And sometimes that's done privately or outside of class, but make sure they have those resources.
I love that we're coming back full circle to our social emotional learning strategies and supports there. Thank you, all three of you. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Conklin now, who is going to read some questions that have been put in the chat for us.
Yes, thank you all so much. It's such a rich discussion, and I'm so appreciative of all your thoughtful perspectives. There's one question in the chat, and I'm going to say this question and then add a little bit to it. So the question is, how do you stay abreast of innovative tools in teaching and bring them to the classroom? And the part that I want to broaden is just in general, how do you, maybe you're not familiar with all the things that you all have been talking about. How do we keep learning ourselves as educators? So what are some things that you all recommend?
All right, as the admin in me, I'm going to start on this one. I think that there's two parts here, but like staying abreast for like the innovative tools and teaching and just staying in the forefront of things is constantly seeking out professional development, seeking out groups and online forums of teachers, so that way you are constantly talking to your people and ensuring that you're talking with other social science teachers and you're getting out there and getting ideas from them. I've already gotten great ideas from Pakaj and Hector today. And that's not to say that I was unfamiliar with the social science standards or what we should be doing when we teach in elections, but I've already learned a lot from them. So get out and talk to people often, as much as you can, as far as, staying abreast of all those things. If you don't know, like what we've been talking about here, then go to illinoiscivics.org, do some research, do your own inquiry on some of the things that we're talking about here today. Really look at your standards too, and maybe that's the curriculum director in me, but really look at those inquiry skills and the disciplinary concepts and what those mean.
Thanks, Shonda. Pakaj or Hector, do you want to weigh in on that one?
I think I've always been open to new ideas. I'm fortunate I work at a small school, so watching the younger teachers, do their thing, it's very inspiring and motivating as well. But ultimately, you just got to try it too, and you got to be comfortable either knowing you might fail and, just being okay with that. But like I said, we work with young people every day, so, they keep you young by force. So, you always got to adapt to meet their needs.
I disagree with what's been said. I think great new PD opportunities and then trying new things and pushing yourself to meet the needs of your students.
Terrific. Thank you. Well, I wonder if I can throw just one final question at all of you. And that is, what evidence have you seen that this work is effective or meaningful to students? So in other words, how do you know that this work matters?
I don't want to start again, but I will. I got to teach first grade and kindergarten, and being able to watch them then grow up, and I actually have a teacher right now who I taught. Yeah, I'm that old. But being able to hear them talk about the projects that we did. And when I say projects, I mean the inquiry-based learning and then the taking action aspect. They don't forget the taking action part of it. So whenever you are doing those inquiry-based learning and whenever you're doing social science standards, you could know a lot. You can teach somebody a lot about math and reading, and you can teach them a lot about the facts and dates that happen in social studies, and then they can sit in a room and do nothing with it ever. But if you teach them civics and how their voice can be heard and how they can create positive change, then wow, you've done something. So I would just say that for me, especially all you elementary teachers out there, it's one of the most important things you can do, because you can teach a lot to a lot and they can just keep it up there in their brain. But if they can't get it out into the world and to help to shape change, it's not doing anything.
Thank you, Shonda. Hector and Pankaj, can you speak to this question of how you know the work matters? What have you seen in your students?
There's never any like real data that gives you feedback on it. It's not like coaching sports, you know. I guess what I can lean on is like just knowing that those relationships we built, like we can disagree politically, we can, you know, have the biggest difference in idea, but just like knowing that we respected each other in that space and worked together regardless of our differences, like that's something that you know we are going to remember forever. So it might be like, you know, when they're seniors and they graduate and they still say hi to you and good morning and they're so cordial. Or even right now, I got a message from a kid who graduated last year on G-Chan. He's like, how's life without me? You know, things like that. That's the only feedback we get. And that's how we know it all mattered.
I agree. I think sometimes you hear from kids who took the class or were with you in the past, and now they're engaged or they're involved. They're working with a community organization or interning within a local elected official, or they're excited to tell you that they voted or they registered to vote because now they live in a swing state. So those are things I think that keep you going. And at the end of the year, hopefully kids, they'll say to you, I feel more comfortable talking to my family and friends about issues that are important to me. And I'm able to develop those relationships and listen to people who disagree with me, which is maybe the most important thing they can learn all of school, whatever field they want to go into in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Dr. Conklin, if you don't mind me stepping in, since you know I'm on the data side of this, I'll just say there is a number of research studies that show that this work is effective. So it shows that students are 40% more likely to vote, that the earlier you start, the more voting becomes a habit. That talking about these issues does not actually indoctrinate students at all. In fact, it often doesn't change their minds, but it makes them more empathetic to others' points of view. So there's a bunch of research out there that those of us on the university side are doing to try to show the value of this work. So definitely, for those of you willing to engage in it, it is worthwhile and it is effective. So thank you for that. And I don't know, Dr. Conklin, if there was any questions. I know there's a lot of pre-service teachers in this room, but do we have any like specific recommendations, or maybe even you have for pre-service teachers doing this work, or anyone on the panel as well? Is there something you would say back to yourself when you were getting your licensure? What might be some good things to do in preparation for this?
Yes, that's a great question for our panelists. And we have maybe 30 seconds if anybody has some final words of wisdom on that front. It's a great question.
It's one of the reasons why I became a teacher, is to have these complicated conversations in sort of tense times. And I think it gives my life, you know, purpose and meaning. So it's exciting, it's challenging, but this is why we do it.
Fabulous, fabulous. All right. Well, folks, oh, sorry, Leah, were you going to say something?
No, I was just gonna say, you know, to the pre-service teachers that, you know, they picked a wonderful career, that, you know, they are the vanguards of our society in a lot of ways. And, you know, they do help, you know, keep the civil discourse in this country alive. And they're more important than, you know, anyone can, you know, can tell them.
That's awesome. And I would just make a plug for the Teaching for Democracy Alliance. If you are interested in this work, they have a ton of resources out there. They have a matrix that splits up what teachers can do, admin can do. So definitely check them out for some resources too, in addition to what the panelists recommended.
Well, thank you all so much. I can't thank our panelists enough for sharing your precious time and your expertise with us. It was such a rich discussion. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. Please do be on the lookout for future College of Education forums. And everybody who registered will get an email with the link to the recording to share with other folks. So with that, I want to wish everyone a good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.